Hello students, welcome to the second part of the digestive system lecture. As a reminder, I want to let you know where we left off last time. We left off with the pharynx, which is, at least in part, from an anterior view, that structure that I've surrounded in the blue square. But if you look at it from a posterior view, this entire structure is the pharynx. So this is an anterior view of the digestive system, and this is posterior. And where we're going to move on to now is, at least for the time being, the esophagus. So all of this is the esophagus. So both from an anterior view and a posterior view, you can see that the esophagus is this structure that's carrying food and or drink down to the stomach. So let's go that I really like. That shows you the junction. There it is. So let me erase some of this other business here real quick. So in this photo, you can really see quite easily from a posterior view the junction of the esophagus and the stomach. So this structure that you see right here, all of that is going to be the stomach. So that's where we're going next. So the greater omentum kind of hangs down like a fatty apron. And so here you can see it in yellow. That's that greater omentum, and you can see it hanging off of the greater curvature of the stomach. Although it's not included in here, the lesser omentum would be here, kind of anchoring that stomach to the inferiormost portion of the liver. Kind of think of the duodenum as a digestive mixing bowl, meaning like, okay, chyme has just left the stomach, and now what's going to happen is the pancreas, the gallbladder, and the liver are going to add its enzymes to that chyme in the duodenum. So let me go ahead and erase that here. And let's look at this from a posterior view. And here would be the duodenum. I'll just point to that with blue arrows. And here's the pancreas. Here's the gallbladder, that little green structure right there. And then this right here is the liver. So you can't really see all of the connections or the ducts leading from each one of these accessory organs to the duodenum. But just know the pancreas, I'll get a different color. The pancreas is going to secrete enzymes into the duodenum. The gallbladder is going to secrete enzymes, and the liver will secrete digestive enzymes all into this first section of the small intestines, all into the duodenum. And this is really where chemical digestion is going to increase. Those enzymes are going to start breaking down the components of that chyme, preparing the components of that chyme to be absorbed in other areas. And move on, learn a little bit more about the esophagus. In part 1, we learned that the entire GI tract is made of 4 layers. And if you recall what those layers are, from deep to superficial, they're mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and a visceral peritoneum. Now, it's not always called visceral peritoneum. That is in all locations except the esophagus. So the esophagus doesn't have visceral peritoneum. It doesn't have that serous membrane as its most superficial layer. What it has is a layer of dense irregular connective tissue that we call adventitia. So that's a difference here with the esophagus versus elsewhere in the GI tract. That outermost layer is referred to as adventitia. It's dense, irregular connective tissue, not a serous membrane, so we don't call it visceral peritoneum. Okay? So the esophagus is a muscular tube. Where's that muscle? That muscle's in this layer, the muscularis externa. So it's this muscular tube that progresses inferiorly from the pharynx. It's behind or posterior to the trachea, and it descends down the thoracic cavity through a hole in the diaphragm called the esophageal hiatus. And then that joins with the stomach at a structure that we call the esophageal sphincter. And that esophageal sphincter is a smooth muscle that should contract to prevent stomach contents, like stomach acid, from regurgitating into the esophagus. The function of the esophagus is deglutition, or swallowing, right? So delivering food and or drink down to the stomach. And it does that through the process of peristalsis. That process of peristalsis is, if you can imagine, like squeezing a nearly empty toothpaste tube. You grasp or squeeze the toothpaste tube and then slide your fingers down the length of it. That's the process of peristalsis. So the esophagus carries out swallowing by squeezing that tube and pushing the contents down towards the stomach. The mucosa, the deepest lining that lines the lumen of the esophagus, is made of stratified squamous epithelial tissue. That stratified squamous, remember, provides a protective layer of cells on the deepest surface of the esophagus. Another modification that we see in these layers that we learned about is that the entire muscularis externa is not just one type of muscle. The muscularis externa is skeletal muscle in the superiormost third, and then it gradually becomes mixed or starts to transition into smooth muscle. So right around the middle of the esophagus, it's mixed, a mixture of skeletal and smooth muscle, and then by the time you get to the inferiormost third of the esophagus, it's all smooth muscle. These steps of swallowing that you see in this graphic at the bottom, they're neat to understand how swallowing occurs, but I'm not going to hold you responsible for them during our strange, crazy spring 2020 COVID semester. So you can look at that, but you won't be tested on that. One last thing I want to mention, if I haven't mentioned it already, I just don't remember. What you swallow, let me erase that. When you swallow something, after you've masticated it in your mouth and you swallow, the name of what you swallow is called a bolus. So the bolus passes down the esophagus, and the bolus then enters the stomach. There's a picture from the so see all of those. In this micrograph, you can see the esophagus in cross section. So you're looking at it from a superior view. I guess you could be looking at it from an inferior view too. So here's the lumen of the esophagus. That's the passageway where food and drink would pass through, that white area. You can kind of see that it's collapsed on itself. It's not a perfect donut-like circle. All of this is lumen, right? And what's one of the reasons for it being collapsed like this, not open full time, is that the esophagus only opens when you swallow to allow food to pass through, and then kind of collapses on itself. And this helps to prevent bacteria from unnecessarily entering through the oral cavity and making their way into the stomach. It's not a tube that needs to be open full time, like, say, the trachea. It only allows for passage of food and or drink, and then kind of seals itself off after that. Another thing I want to draw your attention to are the different layers. Remember, we learned about the layers that are consistent not only all throughout the GI tract, but in all body tubes. All body tubes are going to have this general pattern of organization, where you have an epithelial tissue layer lining the inside of the tube, that epithelial tissue anchored to a structural layer, could be muscle or could be cartilage, and then superficial to all of that will be either a connective tissue layer or some sort of serous membrane. So we learned about the names of the different layers in the GI tract. The deepest, remember, is called the mucosa, and that mucosa has 3 sublayers to it. It's got A, the epithelium, so from here to here would be stratified squamous in the esophagus anyways. B, the lamina propria, which is going to be loose connective tissue, areolar connective tissue. And then finally, letter C, the 3rd sublayer of the mucosa, is going to be that muscularis mucosa. So that would be from here to here. So those are the 3 sublayers of the deepest layer of the GI tract. But then remember that superficial to the mucosa is what we call a submucosa, and that's going to be made of dense irregular connective tissue. So that's the 2nd layer. And then the 3rd layer of the GI tract will be the muscularis externa. And that's going to be pretty much the remainder of what you see here, that muscularis externa. Imagine, though, for a minute, it's not visible in this micrograph, but imagine a really thin line of tissue, a real thin serous membrane, what I'm drawing here in yellow. That would be the 4th layer, what we call visceral peritoneum. And it's called visceral peritoneum in all areas of the GI tract except the esophagus. So if I go back and erase this, there's no visceral peritoneum surrounding the esophagus. Rather, it's what we call adventitia. It's not shown here, but I'll kind of draw it in. Adventitia is dense irregular connective tissue. Imagine a layer here of dense irregular connective tissue surrounding that esophagus. And that adventitia helps to anchor the esophagus within the thoracic cavity, as well as keeping it upright. So that adventitia cannot be seen in this photo. But that's the histology of the esophagus. Bolus that swallows structures and small. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, that esophagus is going to carry food and or drink down to the stomach. So that's the structure that we'll look at now. Let me back. Makes its way down the esophagus and is going to enter right here into the stomach. It's going to pass through that esophageal sphincter. Sometimes that esophageal sphincter is called the cardiac sphincter. I don't mind what it is you call it. Prior to moving on and understanding the functions of the stomach and some of its modifications, let's just real quickly look at its general kind of gross anatomy here. So the region where the esophagus meets the stomach, right here, that's called the cardia. And the upper rounded part that you see right here is called the fundus. I guess it would extend a little bit farther. And then the remainder of the majority of the stomach is what we call the body. So I guess all of this would be the body right here. And then distal to all of that, the distal-most portion of the stomach then is going to be a region where you see it begins to narrow, and that's called the pylorus. So those are the three main regions of the stomach. Let me go ahead and erase this because I've drawn too much all over it. Okay, some other notable features here, externally at least, are going to be this curve that you see right here. That's called the lesser curvature. And so usually when we say lesser, that means there's something very similar that's bigger. And so along this side right here, there's a curve that we call the greater curvature. Now, hanging off of the lesser curvature is a serous membrane that we'll learn a little bit about its composition later, but a serous membrane that we refer to as the lesser omentum. And it's got some fat in here, as you can see. All of that. There's some blood vessels passing through there. But this sheet, this grayish sheet that you see here, is the lesser omentum, and that's going to anchor the stomach to the inferior-most portion of the liver. And then, kind of hanging off the greater curvature is going to be another omentum that you see here, and that's called the greater omentum. Now, they've cut the greater omentum because they just can't fit everything in. Okay, so I've mentioned already what we call the esophageal sphincter. And remember, sphincters are smooth muscle. So you've got a smooth muscle regulating entrance of material. I guess I don't even know if I should dare to draw it. But let's just imagine a circular muscle right here that's going to regulate entrance of material into the esophagus, or alternatively, prevent food from and or drink or stomach acid from leaving. So you've got a sphincter at the proximal most portion of the stomach. And down here, I know you can't see it, but again, let's just imagine there being a circular muscle right here in the pylorus, and that's called the pyloric sphincter. So that will contract also to keep food or stomach contents in the stomach. So both of those sphincters are going to contract so that while there's food or digestible material in the stomach has the ability to grind and work on that food and break down that food without the food leaving out the pylorus or without that food leaving out the esophagus. So essentially, those sphincters seal off any exits from the stomach, so the food stays in there and the stomach can work on it. Now, internally, I want to point out structures that are called rugae. And those rugae are going to be these folds that you see here. And the first instinct for students when I ask about what their function might be is to say, oh, they increase the surface area. Well, that's a good guess because oftentimes when we see folded structures somewhere, it indicates that there's some sort of absorption going on because those folds increase the surface area to volume ratio. But that's not the case here with the stomach. Very little is absorbed through the wall of the stomach in the way of nutrients. Things like water, salts, aspirin, alcohol, those things can get absorbed through the wall of the stomach, but for the most part, nutrients can't. So what the rugae are meant to do is allow for the stomach to expand when there are larger volumes of food on the inside. So this would be an empty stomach where you can clearly see the rugae, but imagine eating or stuffing 2 pizzas inside this little stomach right here. The stomach's going to stretch, and those folds are going to get stretched out, and allow for the stomach to accommodate those two pizzas. And then when that food leaves the stomach, the rugae, they fold back up on one another. So in this case, these folded structures allow for accommodating greater volumes of food. Earlier, quick though, I'm going to go picture. So now that we've gone over the gross anatomy of the stomach, let's go ahead and look at the histology of the stomach. So what this picture is showing you here is just a section, just a small section of the wall of the stomach itself. And one of the things that you can see, or one of the several things that you can see pretty clearly, are the layers. So let me get a different color here. I'll use blue. And here's the mucosa. Then superficial to that would be the submucosa. And superficial to all of that would be the muscularis externa. And here now you see that really thin layer just right here, which would be that visceral peritoneum. It's really easy to see all of those different layers. And another thing we can easily see are the folds in the stomach, the rugae, the folds that allow for the stomach to expand to accommodate greater volumes of food. Another thing we can see in this picture, I guess I'll use green, are the simple columnar epithelial cells. So now we've seen the epithelium change. In the esophagus, the epithelium of the mucosa was stratified squamous. Here in the stomach, it's now simple columnar. And remember, a function of simple columnar, the function of simple columnar is absorption or secretion. Not much gets absorbed through the wall of the stomach. Remember, water, salts, alcohol, and aspirin are pretty much the only things that get absorbed through the wall of the stomach. So absorption, yes, it does occur, but more so, the stomach is responsible for secreting a number of products that assist in various aspects of digestion. And then lastly, before we move on, I just want to introduce to you these structures that we call gastric pits. And those gastric pits lead to what we call gastric glands. So the gastric pits are like these invaginations that you see right here, these infoldings, and they lead to glands that are going to be secreting some sort of product onto the surface of the stomach. So hydrochloric acid, for instance, is a product that's created by these gastric glands, so that hydrochloric acid will make its way up onto the surface of the stomach. One of these to a picture here. So let's get back to where. Okay, let's take a little bit closer look at the these gastric pits and these gastric glands. So the cells that make up the gastric pits and the gastric glands vary. They vary in their structure and they vary in their function. So first off, let's look at the mucus cells. They secrete mucus onto the surface of the epithelium to protect those epithelial cells from the enzymes that the gastric glands make and also the acid that the stomach makes. You wouldn't want the acidic environment of the stomach to kill or damage the cells that are responsible for covering that the stomach itself. The pH of the stomach is somewhere around 2, so it's pretty low. That's pretty acidic. And the function of that acid in the stomach is really to kill pathogens any pathogens that you might ingest with your food. We haven't always been cooking our food, so imagine prior to creating fire, all of the raw foods that humans consumed and all of the pathogens, microorganisms that would be consumed with that food went down into the stomach. So many of those pathogens or those microorganisms can't survive at a pH of 2. So that pH of 2 essentially disassembles pathogens and microorganisms, so they're not able to harm the body or get into deeper areas of the body and cause infection. Oftentimes students think that the acid is what's involved in breaking down food, and it is to a very limited extent, but that's more of a byproduct of its main function, which is killing pathogens. The parietal cells are cells that are located down in the gastric glands, and that's these cells right here. And they're going to secrete hydrochloric acid. And that hydrochloric acid, yes, is going to assist with protein digestion, but it doesn't do that on its own. That hydrochloric acid is necessary. That hydrochloric acid is necessary to convert an enzyme called pepsinogen into its much more active form called pepsin. So when pepsinogen is mixed with hydrochloric acid, then it becomes this really powerful enzyme called pepsin. So that's how the hydrochloric acid is used for protein digestion. The hydrochloric acid on its own doesn't carry out that protein digestion. All it does is it activates pepsinogen and turns that pepsinogen into pepsin, and pepsin is the enzyme that breaks down proteins. So parietal cells, they're making hydrochloric acid for activating pepsinogen, but they're also secreting what we call intrinsic factor, and that is something that's necessary for vitamin B12 absorption. The most common cells making up a gastric gland then are going to be chief cells. Sometimes they're called peptic cells. But what they do is they secrete this precursor to pepsin, which is pepsinogen. So they secrete pepsinogen, and then when that pepsinogen gets mixed with hydrochloric acid, then it turns into pepsin. Pepsin, as I mentioned earlier, is a really strong enzyme. So if the chief cells secreted pepsin already made, the pepsin is so strong that it would start digesting the cells that actually make it. So rather than creating pepsin directly, the chief cells secrete pepsinogen, and then pepsinogen mixed with hydrochloric acid then becomes pepsin and is less harmful to the cells when it's carried out in that process. And then lastly, I'm not sure if you can see it, are the what we call enteroendocrine cells. Sometimes they're called G cells. They secrete a hormone called gastrin that helps to regulate emptying of the stomach. So it helps to regulate opening up the pylorus and emptying the chyme from the stomach into the first section of the small intestine called the duodenum. So that's what those enteroendocrine cells are doing, those G cells. Before we learn about some of the functions, or kind of before I state what those functions are, let's look at some further modifications of the stomach. We've already seen how the epithelium is a simple columnar. We've seen in the stomach how the epithelium is folded into rugae, and deep in those rugae are what we call gastric pits and gastric glands. Those are modifications, but we also see modifications in the muscularis externa. Everywhere else in the GI tract, there are 2 layers of smooth muscle making up the muscularis externa. Bear with my drawing here. Let's just draw a Pardon me. Give me a sec. If we were to draw a generic section of GI tract, and this isn't the stomach necessarily, not quite yet anyways, the fibers of the muscularis externa are going to normally be what we call an outer longitudinal layer. So the smooth muscle fibers are laid down longitudinally along the tube, and then there would be an inner circular layer where the muscle fibers wrap around the tube in this fashion. With the stomach, they're layered like this, where you've got the outer longitudinal layer, you've got a middle circular layer, and then deep to all of that, the very innermost layer of muscle of the muscularis externa would be fibers that are laid down in an oblique fashion, like this. So what this allows for is the stomach to contract in many different directions in order to help mechanically break down food. Mechanical breakdown of food is pretty much the main function of the stomach. It breaks food, or it breaks that bolus down into what we call chyme. So a bolus enters the stomach and chyme comes out through these mixing waves that are carried out by those three layers of the stomach. The stomach also acts as a temporary storage facility for food, and as you know, helps us to create intrinsic factors so that we can absorb vitamin B12. And it's the location where we begin to digest proteins, not absorb, but digest proteins. Remember, proteins are hundreds of thousands of amino acids long, and the bonds between those amino acids need to be broken. These enzymes in the stomach, particularly pepsin, is going to start breaking down those proteins into polypeptides, and eventually polypeptides will get broken down into amino acids. So we begin the chemical digestion of proteins here. That shows you the, real quick, and show you what stomach. So from the stomach, the chyme leaves and makes its way into the small intestines. So right here would be the beginning of the small intestines. And the small intestine can be broken up into three main regions, which I'll get to in a second. So just so you can visualize, let's just kind of imagine some gooey chyme, or kind of this liquefied food, leaving the stomach and making its way into the intestines. And gradually what that chyme will do is it'll travel, I won't be able to follow exactly here, but it'll travel all the way through the small intestines. And as it's traveling through the small intestines, it's further getting chemically digested. Bonds are being broken. That food that you've eaten is now being broken down to its smallest components. And the small intestines are essentially where all of the absorption of nutrients occurs. The stomach was just mechanically breaking it down and beginning the chemical digestion process. So you'll see some modifications in the small intestines that are designed for increasing absorption of nutrients. You've got two pictures here. They really aren't all that different, except for this picture here has the large intestine, or the colon, still wrapped around the small intestines. And in the picture on the right, I removed it so you could see this first section of the small intestines that we call the duodenum, or the duodenum, however you'd like to pronounce it. So that's really the only difference in those two pictures. I just wanted to make sure that you could see the connection between the stomach and the probably go maybe greater omentum. This is how your book shows it to you. So this is the exact same graphic from your book. The first section of the small intestine that you see in blue, like I mentioned, is called the duodenum. It's pretty short compared to the other sections. It's only about 10 inches in length. And its function is to receive chyme from the stomach, but also it's going to receive secretions from the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. So the second section of the small intestine is what we call the jejunum. It's kind of a fun word to say, and begins here and ends roughly right about somewhere around here. And the jejunum is the part of the small intestine where the majority of absorption occurs. There's more digestion that occurs there too. You have to consider digestion along a continuum, where chemical digestion begins in the duodenum and then continues along the further you move throughout the jejunum. So you still got chemical digestion occurring here, and you've also got nutrient absorption occurring there. The third section of the small intestine is what we call the ileum, and that is just really a continuation of the jejunum. It's a little bit longer. It's about 12 inches long, and sorry, not 12 inches, 12 feet long, and it connects to the first section of the colon, which would be right about there, called the cecum. So chyme is going to continue to travel through here, all the way through here, and all through all these parts. And eventually that chyme is going to make its way into the large intestine, eventually. When we get to the large intestine, I'll tell you how that works. Okay. Really looks like. Let's look at some of the modifications of the small intestine. Remember that primarily the job of the small intestine is chemical digestion and absorption of nutrients. So we're going to see modifications of the small intestine for that purpose. So you'll see modifications both in the mucosa, the innermost layer, as well as in the submucosa, in the wall of the intestines. Both of those are designed to increase the surface area. Both of those are designed to increase the surface area for absorption. So if we were to look at just a small section of the small intestine right here and then magnify that section, you'll see these modifications. One of those modifications are what we call plicae circularis. So this little speed bump, so to speak, that you see right here, that is one plica. Plica is singular. Plicae circularis is just plural. So these are folds. Let's look at the layers here. So right here would be the mucosa, but right here is the submucosa. And you see how the submucosa is kind of thrown into this fold right here? And then that, in effect, throws the epithelium into a fold. So those plicae circularis are going to increase the surface area for absorption, and they're most prominent or most abundant in the jejunum. On a smaller level, the modification of the mucosa are projections as well that help increase the surface area, but those are called villi. And so if we look a little bit more closely here, these villi are these little projections that you see here. There's one here. I mean, every one of these little folds of the mucosa is what we call a villus. Villi is plural. Villus is singular. So those are modifications in the small intestine that help to increase the surface area for nutrient absorption. Let me move back to here. If we look at a chunk of the small intestine a little bit more closely, you can easily see these villi right here. Right? And if I just point it out to you, all of this from here to here is mucosa, right? And if we were to zoom in on that mucosa, you see one villus right here. That should be villus. This, oops, I'm trying to make this as accurate as I can for you. So this one villus that you see right here, you can see the epithelium. So the epithelium, as you know, in the small intestines is simple columnar with microvilli on their surface. So you can see the simple columnar cells kind of going up, being folded into this villus, and then coming back down in this direction. So those villi are what the epithelium here are what we call absorptive cells. They're simple columnar cells with microvilli on their surface. Sometimes all those microvilli are referred to as the brush border. Just so you know, it's another term. So those cells not only carry out absorption of nutrients, like literally nutrients, let's just say it's a molecule of glucose, for example, or a molecule of fructose. Those molecules are literally going to get transported through the cells and come out the other side, and those molecules then make their way into the blood vessels. And the blood then just carries those nutrients all throughout the body. So, yes, those are absorptive cells absorbing nutrients, but they're also going to be making enzymes that further break down disaccharides. So those enzymes would be called disaccharide or peptidases. These are enzymes that continue the breakdown of protein. So that carries out the final digestion of carbohydrates and proteins. And another thing I want to point out to you is that most nutrients, with the exception of fats, can be taken directly into the blood vessels here. Fats, though, however, have to take a different route. So in the submucosa, you're going to find lymphatic vessels, these yellow structures that you see right there. Fats cannot make their way directly into blood vessels. They don't get absorbed into the blood vessels. Those fats are going to make their way into the lymphatic vessels and make their way then through the lymphatic vessels and ultimately throughout the body. So this is just one different method of absorption of a macronutrient. Carbs, proteins, and nucleic acids can be absorbed through the wall of those absorptive cells and directly into the bloodstream. Fats have to take lymphatic vessels. Or not. And lastly, we're still looking at the same picture, but I want to point out to you another feature of the small intestines called intestinal glands. So intestinal glands are essentially found within what we call intestinal crypts. And these glands are what secrete intestinal juice. Yes, that's the actual term. And that is a watery medium that helps to keep the surface of the small intestines wet and allow for these little crypts right here to stay wet, so that enzymes and digestive products can still interact with one another. Or another way to say that is enzymes and digestive products are kept in a watery solution, so that helps to continue digestion, but also helps with absorption. Okay, so I hope that you understand what we've gone over. If not, please feel free to email me anytime. I'm always available for online office hours. This will conclude part 2 of the digestive system, and then there will be one more part, part 3, that I'll be working on next.